Hello, good morning. Welcome to our show. Today, our guest is the distinguished Professor John Garin. Hello, Professor Garin. How are you doing?
Oh, just fine. Glad to be here with you.
And you are a distinguished professor who writes on school choice. Professor Garin, what is the K-12 system? I am not from America. Most of us don't know.
Okay. Well, in the United States, the public schools are almost entirely locally operated based on cities and counties. And but where there's a school district that's established in a local area, and they collect tax revenue from the local citizenry and divide the municipality into zones, then schools are kids are assigned to schools based on the zone they live in. Now, in the last century, I guess that there's been more and more influence of state government over, our states, like Virginia and Missouri and so on, more influence that they have had over local school districts in terms of funding as well as on regulation of them. And certainly in the last 30 or 40 years, there's been more influence of the US federal government on um, public schools through, again, funding and regulation. Now, in addition to that, there have been private schools in the United States for a long time. In fact, the first schools are private schools, um, 2 centuries ago. But the public school system grew in the 18th to 19th centuries and in the 20th century. And most schools are um, public schools, local public schools. About 10% of students in the United States, maybe a little more than that now, um, probably about 12%, are in private schools, oftentimes run by churches, but often not. And these are schools just started by private institutions and are outside the public school system. Um, in the last 30 or 40 years, I guess there's been a move in some states to allow some of the funding that goes towards a public school student's education to be used by the family to attend a private school, through a voucher, what's called a voucher, or an education savings account, where the student, if their family chooses they want to go to a private school, that they might qualify for some funding, uh, state and local funding, that instead of going to the public school that child is assigned to, would go to a private school that the family chooses for the child. And these are what we call school choice programs in the US. And they're actually, apparently, I'm not that familiar with the European system, but apparently that's not uncommon in Europe as well. We've also got another type of school that's emerged here in the US in the last 30 years or so. It's called charter school, where they are actually public schools. They're given a so-called charter to operate a school, but they're frequently allowed a lot of autonomy, and where they don't have to follow all the um, rules and regulations of a public school. And but they are able to tailor their programs more to fit a particular student need. So that's kind of our system of schools that we have here in the US.
So why is school choice so contentious?
So I'm sorry, why is it so?
Why is school choice so contentious? Why do people oppose school choice?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah, because
uh,
I'm from Jamaica and school choice is the norm in Jamaica and
right.
elsewhere.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. Um, well, there's a nice answer and a less pleasant answer. Um, the less pleasant answer is that there are a lot of interest groups that form around any public program. And if you start funding a public program, that there are people who don't want to see that disappear. And school choice is competition for a public program. And if school choice became popular, that public systems would lose students, and those people in charge of those systems would lose political power and political clout. And they don't like it. So there's a lot of pushback. Now that's kind of the unpleasant answer, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. The other side of it would be that people in the United States a lot are unfamiliar with how school choice programs would work, and in many areas, in many areas the public schools are a real mix in terms of how good they are. Some of them, and particularly in more well-to-do areas, are quite good, and then families in those areas don't care about having an option. But in many areas of the U.S., the public schools are not very good. In fact, they're quite bad. And people in those areas are the ones who really need some options. And those areas are typically low income, oftentimes minority neighborhoods and areas, and they typically don't have a lot of political clout. So it's been very, as you say, it's been very contentious here in the United States, particularly in the last decade or so. I think early on, when these programs got started back in the 1960s and 70s, there wasn't as much contentiousness over it. It was sort of viewed as a way by all sides, all political sides, to help low-income students. But that agreement has seemed to have slipped away, unfortunately.
Why do public schools perform so poorly?
Well, that again is a good question, but I think it fundamentally goes back to the nature of public bureaucracies. They are public school systems, and they are a mix of three bureaucracies: the local school district, which is officially run by an elected school board, and then also they're influenced by state bureaucracies, which of course are politically determined, and finally the federal bureaucracy. And of course, these are all based on collecting taxes and spending funds, and that sort of organization, economic organization, breaks the link between performance of an organization and the funds that it gets. So public schools can be quite bad and still retain most, if not all, of their funding. And this is in contrast, of course, to what happens in the private sector, where in any organization producing whatever good or service, if they provide a lousy service and not as good as their competition, then customers leave. And either the poorly performing organization's got to reform itself, or it loses its customers to the other providers. Well, that in large part, that's just not that prominent here in the U.S. So we have these large public bureaucracies who are mostly have very little accountability, in the sense of you might see that they're doing poorly, but there's no consequence for them doing poorly. And so as a result, we have poorly perform. You have no incentive, or very little incentive, for good performance all around for all kinds of students. And so as a result, we have low performance, bad outcomes.
Exactly.
It's really kind of the basics of incentives, right? That we talk about a lot in economics.
Yes. Political economy. The political economy of unions. I was
The,
expecting you to mention unions. I know they block progress in education.
right. Well, I think unions are part of the bureaucracy, really. I think in some ways, um, perhaps unionization is a not necessarily inevitable, but commonplace outcome when you have a large school district that in many areas that is a predominant employer of teachers, the kind of almost a monopoly-like buyer of teacher services. Somewhat of a natural reaction to that would be for the teachers to try to unionize and become a monopoly on the other side, right? And then negotiate stuff. And that's happened in many large metropolitan areas here in the US. And it ends up being oftentimes very contentious negotiations, and teachers, each party is kind of looking out for their own interest, which is not unexpected, and there's nothing wrong with looking out for your own well-being. But I think what gets lost in this is that nobody's really got the incentive to do a really good job for students. Because again, they're playing with public money, taxpayer money, and there's no consequences for performing badly. So in these negotiations that go on between school district administrators and teachers unions, they're of course looking out for their own interests, but there's no fundamental underlying incentive that we've got to do a good job for the kids, the students, and their families. That's just not a big part of the equation, and it gets lost, and there's a lot of contentiousness between us, school districts and teachers unions oftentimes. Now, I live in the state of Kentucky, and we have a teachers union that is not all that powerful, although it does have a lot of media presence. But nevertheless, we still have the problem of the school districts being public bureaucracies that don't really suffer a lot of consequences for bad performance.
Exactly. Uh, the cost of education is prohibitive. It's prohibitive if you are poor American. If you are rich American, your children have access to the best schools globally. But if you are poor American who doesn't benefit from the charter school system, your children could be more likely to fail. That's why I am interested in educational reform, because people who are rich, they have options. Poor people don't have many options.
Well, that's right. That's I think the real problem we have here in the United States, that a lot of low-income neighborhoods have the worst schools, even though the funding is quite high in many low-income neighborhoods. The performance is just not there. And
Exactly.
that's true. That's true. Actually, in Kentucky has a lot of rural areas, as well as we have a couple of larger urban areas as well. But yeah, even in the rural areas, some of the rural districts have more funding than average, and don't perform very well. And they face similar kinds of problems where families from low incomes, kids from low income families are stuck in lousy school districts. And there is really no competitive alternative, because there's no funding that's available. If we had systems where the phrase we like to use is where the funding follows the students, right? So you have students that, wherever they choose or wherever their family choose, that's where the funding goes to the school that they choose, rather than going to a neighborhood school directly. And if we had funding following the students, well, then there would be a funding source for alternative competitors to come in and open schools, even if it's a charter school, or it could be a private school. But we just don't have those options in Kentucky, and unfortunately, many other areas in the United States are like that as well. And so, supposedly, the thing that's supposed to help low-income families, raise themselves out of poverty through more skills and more productivity and more ability to make a good living, that is absent in a lot of areas in the United States. It's very sad.
I agree. However, I must admit, America ranks number one on the Intelligence Capital Index, and America is the best place for scaling talent. So even though the education system in America might not be as impressive as elsewhere, I am undaunted because America is number one for scaling talent.
Okay, well, yeah,
Yeah,
I do think if you've got the skills and the talents, there's still very good rewards for that here in the US. And I think the challenge is for a lot of low-income America is getting there, is that the school system is supposedly set up to help them get there, acquire the skills and talents that then you can earn a really good living. But I think that um, that part of the public school system is really failing low-income America. So, but I think you're right that if you have the skills, that it's the job market is still pretty darn good here in the U.S.
exactly.
and and you can do very well for yourself.
So for instance, some people bash America for not mandating maternity leave, but that's actually a positive because the economy is more productive when it's easier to allocate labor and capital. And when you become an employee, you suspend rights for privileges. Mandated maternity leave is a violation of property rights. So I think it's a positive that maternity leave is not mandated in America. That's really a positive, not a negative.
I think generally having those kinds of regulations in the labor market impedes things. I think I think it's great if employers want to provide those kinds of benefits to
Exactly.
work.
It
Of
is.
course, those things ultimately come out of the wage bill, right? Those are not freebies. They're not free. And so I think having options like that, voluntary options like that for employees, where you can have a job with mandatory leave, but you can have a job that doesn't offer that as well. So in fact, I did this very brief overview. This is years ago of labor markets that had kind of the most regulation and the least regulation, and among OECD countries. These are the well-developed countries in the world, and I think I looked at like who are the most heavily unionized and the most which oftentimes promotes restrictions like this, and the most restrictions on hours and other kinds of regulation. I think OECD has an index of this. And as it turns out, the countries that have the lowest among OECD countries, the lowest of these kind of regulations, this would be like the United States, and there's a couple of others. They have the highest wage growth and the highest levels of employment of all the countries. So these kinds of things do help a subset of workers, but they hinder the overall growth of the economy.
All right. Now back to school choice.
Okay.
I read your paper. Your paper was published in a leading journal recently. It is entitled Enhancing Economic Freedom via School Choice and the Competition. Have state laws been enabling enough to generate broad-based effects? Comment on your findings. How do politicians use laws to enable academic success? That's the basis of your article. And you also mentioned economic freedom. What's this article really about?
Say it again.
What's this article really about? Your article on economic freedom and
Yeah.
enabling student success?
Right. Well, one aspect of economic freedom is obviously a big aspect of economic freedom is allowing choice among how you spend your resources. And there's a big aspect of that missing in a lot of the education system in the United States, right? We have the public system where taxes are raised to pay for it, and kids are assigned to a particular school. So there's no choice in your taxes you pay, and there's no choice in where your child is assigned to school. So there's a real dearth of economic freedom in the education system in the United States. And the way people have got around that tradition is that they move, right? They move from one municipality to another that may have a better school system, or from one neighborhood to another where the school is better. So there's some awkward degree of choice there, but again, it's a very awkward kind of thing to do, to have to move your residence in order to get a better school. I mean, we wouldn't imagine having to move your residence to get, to choose a different physician, say, or to choose a different grocery store. So it is an awkward form of competition. But the so-called school choice legislation that a lot of states have enacted does give a bit more measure of freedom in this regard. And these would be like voucher programs or related programs where funding follows the student, where instead of having to go to the school district that the child is assigned to, and the funding going to that school, that the funding would follow the student to whatever school that their family chooses for them. And so this gives a measure of economic freedom for families where they have more choice over schools. Now, in the US, these programs tended to be fairly small, where there was a fairly small number of students eligible for these programs. And oftentimes other restrictions, financial restrictions, based on how much money could be devoted to the program, and other regulations on program participants, both the schools and the students and family. So my intent of this paper was to look to see if those relatively small school choice programs and charter school programs had a significant effect on statewide education performance in terms of the National Assessment of Education Progress test scores that students that are administered to students by the U.S. government. This is the so-called, I don't know if your audience is familiar with this, but this is the so-called Nations Report Card is the term that's often used for that. And roughly every other year that there's a set of tests that are given to students. And the ones I like to focus on are fourth grade reading and math. And that's what I do for this paper. I've also used eighth grade reading and math, because those are basic skills that you need to succeed in anything. So I like to focus on those. So the point of the paper was to see whether these fairly small measures of economic freedom and choice in the education market had any impact on a state's test scores for their students across the whole, for all students, not just students in the programs. And the idea being that the bigger these programs become, that puts more and more competitive pressure on the public system. If students have an out, and a lot of students take it or might take it, then that provides some degree of incentives for the public systems to improve themselves. So what I did in this paper is I went back to 1990 all the way forward through 2019. This was all data and programs before COVID, and looked at all states for all years between 1990 and 2019, and collected data on what degree of choice students had, school choice students had, as well as charter school programs, and then looked at other aspects of their educational programs, like their funding, their government funding, and also the test score outcomes for fourth grade reading and math. And as it turns out, I get rather somewhat startling. I was a little surprised by the findings. The findings are that states that have implemented voucher programs and also education savings account programs have shown rather large increases in the test scores of their students, the fourth grade reading and math performance, and much larger than any effect of funding that per pupil funding that states that states have for their programs. So the per pupil funding does have a positive effect on these test score performance, but it's very small. In fact, very, I mean, just not, if you want a significant increase in a substantial increase in test scores, that the funding just doesn't really make much of it, wouldn't really make much of it in. But so I was kind of surprised how big the effects of voucher programs and education savings account programs were. And so I did a lot of sensitivity checks to make sure it wasn't, some outlier state, that was, the data was wrong or something. And no, it's not, there's no crazy outlier data that's driving the results. And there's another concern that perhaps states that implement these programs had been on an upward trajectory beforehand. And as it turns out, that's mostly not true. So it's really, I think it's pretty robust findings that states that implement these are doing a lot better. Now, it turns out, it looks like the key to the success is having enough funding per student, because there's what I found is the programs tend to fall into two kind of categories. One kind of program is that there's a lot of students eligible, but not much funding available per student. And then another type of program, which tends to be the voucher and ESA, which are acronym for Education Savings Account. The ESAs tend to have not that many students eligible, but they have a lot of funding per pupil. And it's the latter kind of program that seems to generate the strong results. And what it looks like is that in order for there to be a substantial effect on the entire school system, public school system, is that there needs to be enough funding behind the choice program so that it's a credible threat for families to leave the public system and go into private. And it seems like that these programs that have only a little bit of money per pupil don't seem to be providing that sort of credible threat, as we say.
I agree with your findings. You also did a study on Kentucky showing that resources don't enhance outcomes. The best resource is the student and then the teacher. The best predictor of student performance, other than the genetic and cultural potential of the student, is the ability of the teacher. The teacher is a serious human resource. So when people say that students are not doing well because of resources, I laugh. I'm young, but I do remember being in high school and having friends who did not have access to the internet. They went to the library and they did really well in their exams. So when we mention physical resources, we're really referring to the internet. But beyond that, the only resource is the teacher. And then, oh yes, the student. But resources don't really matter that much. As long as the teacher at the classroom and is able to teach, students will learn. In the 1980s, how did students learn? Was there the internet? Were they using computers? No, most of them were not.
Right. Yeah, I think those are tools to learn, but you got to have the basics. They are certainly augment learning, but you got to have the basic teacher-student relationship, as well as the parents need to be involved.
Exactly.
Now, I should mention charter schools here as well, because I want to say a word about that and related to what you're talking about, because I include charter schools in my analysis, and charter schools do show a pretty substantial effect. If the charter school system has got enough autonomy and freedom to tailor their program. And charter schools that don't have much autonomy and freedom don't seem to show much improvement, but for their test scores for the state. But charter schools that do have a lot of autonomy and freedom, they apparently do present a substantial competitive um, competitive alternative for parents. But the reason I want to bring up charter schools is it speaks to what you're talking about, is that charter schools in many of these low income areas in the US, particularly like New York and Boston, they have figured out how to reach low income kids who come from kind of rough backgrounds, and their teachers are very good. And of course, if they fail to succeed, well, then the students don't show up and they lose their funding. So they have some pretty good incentives there. And the funding of charter schools, by the way, in most states, it depends on the state you're in, but in most states, the funding of charter schools is substantially less than the funding of the typical regular traditional public school. And so, yes, they do well. They do incredibly well in many urban areas without the funding, the level of funding that regular public schools have. They also, I think, many of these charter schools, and I presume private schools do this as well, they really make an effort to engage the parents, where they, have these discussions with parents ahead of the school, before school starts, and they have to agree to, monitor their children's homework and, come in for conferences and so on. So they really make an effort to engage with the parents, which I think is an important part of having a student do well, that it's important for the parents to be engaged in addition to the teacher, as well as the student, of course.
All right. And autonomy is important. Autonomy encourages innovation and people respond to innovation. Students have different preferences, different interests. What works for one person doesn't work for the other person. That's why autonomy promotes academic performance. So we're wrapping up and thanks for coming on.
Okay, well, I
Yeah.
agree with your last comment, and happy to be with you.
All right. Bye, John.
Okay, bye-bye.